Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Emily Best. I'm the founder and CEO of Seed and Spark, which is the parent company to our new platform, Film Forward. And welcome to the first in what will be an ongoing inclusive leadership series. We're so excited you're here and for the unbelievable lineup of guests we have for you over the coming months. Film Forward, because we're relatively new, is a unique experiential learning platform that replaces boring corporate training videos with award-winning short cinema from around the world. And it's built to introduce dynamic stories to audiences that typically would never otherwise see them. And just for fun, our Film Forward programs pay the filmmakers 193 times what they'd be making on streaming platforms while delivering remarkable learning outcomes for the organizations where we show them. Building off the success of our foundational Behaviors of Belonging curriculum, we've created a new curriculum that develops the 6 fundamental traits of inclusive leadership, the 6 C's: cognizance, curiosity, courage, commitment, cultural intelligence, and collaboration. And to celebrate the launch of this new program, we're hosting this series with some of our very favorite people leaders and executives who we think embody and can tell really incredible stories about the 6 C's in action. And when I thought about how would we kick this off, there was the one person that came to mind, and her name is Aubrey Blanche. She is the founder and CEO of MathPath, which if you take mathematics or mathematician and empath and you put them together, you get MathPath. And she's also the Senior Director of Equitable Design, Product, and People at Culture Amp. So she's in the future already, literally. She's joining us from tomorrow in Australia. So she already knows more than we do today. She's also one of the most courageous leaders I know. And so we knew she'd be an unbelievable resource in building and demonstrating courage and accountability in the real world. So that's our topic today, is courage. Aubrey, welcome.
Thank you so much, Em. I'm so excited to be here. I've just been such a fan of all of our conversations that we've had since I sat for like an hour in a phone booth at Atlassian so many years ago. But also, I think because of the way that you're bringing a different and dynamic way that we think about leadership and the way we encourage people to go on inclusive leadership journeys, I think it's pretty clear to me that the ways we've been doing it don't work. And so bringing new ways of helping people be the best leaders they can, I think, is always exciting. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much. So I want to dive right in to, how do you think about courage in the workplace, and particularly as it relates to leaders?
Well, I think when I think about courage, the first thing that comes up for me is these ideas of fear and risk. And so one of the quotes, and I'm going to butcher who it's from, but this idea of courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. And so I think that if you're doing leadership right in general, it requires a tremendous amount of courage, because the fact is everything you do as a leader should be terrifying. Because if you're taking proper sort of responsibility and accountability for the sheer impact that you have because of the power that's conferred to you when you're considered a leader or in a position of leadership, you should be constantly self-conscious about what you're doing and the impact you're having with that. And so to me, courageous leadership is about constant risk taking. And the more mature you become as a leader, I hope you become more courageous. And what I define that as is you taking intentional risks. So you know the risks you're taking and the ones you're not willing to take. And because of your own often self-education, you're better able to actually align your actions to those articulated values. But when I think in inclusion in particular, where courage shows up most often for me is I have to have the courage to be wrong or to fuck up. Hopefully not in a way that harms other people, but most of my greatest learnings around equity and around inclusion have come when I've taken a risk to say, I don't know, or I may have done something wrong in the past and I want to make that better. And I think that can be really hard because as a leader, our culture tells us that you have to be right all the time and you have to know the answers.
Yes.
And I think courageous leadership is more about humility uh, in that sense.
I want that on a t-shirt. Like the courage of humility. And we see this a lot, that And I think there's a real powerful cultural shift happening. That sound is my husband letting the dog out, who is going to start barking at the door. Yay, working from home. And pretty soon, I'm sure a 3-year-old will be in here with opinions. And she is herself quite courageous. What I really want to pick up on is just that the nature of leadership is risk management, right? And if you're assuming risk, you have to do things that are risky, whether or not they scare you. I was thinking of this beautiful cartoon I saw once of a couple, and the man says, "I'm scared," and she holds his hand and says, "Well, then we do it with fear." And there's something really beautiful about that, because I think when you think about risk, there's the piece of it that is about humility, and there's also the piece of it kind of about partnership, right? And so I'd be curious, when you think about courage and the practice of courage, what are some ways this shows up in the workplace?
I think the place where this shows up, and often the place where I'm coaching leaders the most, is to prioritize, or like if you think about this risk management, prioritize or hold more extreme the risk that someone will stop speaking up over the risk of being criticized. And what I mean by that is because so often people who are marginalized like they don't trust that they'll be heard if they speak up. They'll perceive that they're going to be retaliated against if they speak up. And the fact is, like, they're right? Like, that's a rational set of fears. So as a leader, like, the worst thing you can hear is nothing, because it doesn't mean the absence of problems. It means there's a secondary problem, which is that no one will tell you what those problems are, which they will definitely get worse if you don't know where they are, because you can't address them. And so for me, that's the first and most important thing, is like, as a leader, if you're getting negative feedback from the right people, that is actually a sign that you're doing something correctly. So it's a flip of like the general script where we say like, oh, if I'm not hearing anything bad, like that must mean that we're doing a really good job. I actually flip that. And for me, like, if I'm hearing what's not working, because I believe the world is inequitable and unfair. And so people from marginalized groups, like, not everything will be going peachy for them at all times. But if I care about creating a great experience for everyone, that starts with people from underrepresented or marginalized groups. And so if I'm getting the critical feedback from those groups especially, that means that I'm actually able to effectively manage what I consider the great risks to an organization or to culture. And so it but that's terrifying. Like, you're like asking to tell me why I'm doing my job poorly is not also a fun experience. The other thing that I always remind myself is, I used to host this happy hour with some folks, and we had a rule that only one person per company could come, but we called the happy hour "Leadership Sucks." And the idea of that was, it was meant to be just like an outlet and like a safe, emotionally supportive space where if you were in a position of leadership and you shared this philosophy of, like, what I always tell my team is, if it goes right, it's on you. If it goes wrong, it's on me. Um, like, you need your vet space for that. And that's what I think it is like, as a leader, if you're hearing the problems,
Yeah.
that means that you've created trust, but you're also better able to do your job.
Yes. I just mirrored my camera because I realized it looked like I was looking away from you while I was looking at you. And I was like, that looks shifty. And if we're talking about courage, I don't want to look shifty for this whole thing. How has this kind of definition of courage played out in your leadership career? And can I tell a little anecdote really quickly?
Yeah.
When we were doing the research for Film Forward and we were asking questions about, what are folks getting right and wrong about inclusion? What is the hardest thing for organizations to do? And I remember you said, it's hardest for organizations to admit what they don't give a shit about. And I was like, oh my God, like, that's the bravery it would take to be like, here's what's in scope and here's what's out of scope. And most organizations are not willing to actually say that thing. But I just remember being like, I'm going to be thinking about that for the rest of my life.
But it's so true. Like, I think the context of what we were talking about in that conversation, and I like very deeply remember that, because I didn't like mean to tell you that, it just like came
Awesome.
bursting forth, was this idea that I was in the middle of fighting the fight to like have anti-racism prioritized in the work I was doing, and I was getting like the gender door slammed in my face. They were like, no, 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 we care about women. And I was like, yes, Black women are women. And like I wasn't getting very far with that discussion. And so that was the thing for me is I wanted, and I wasn't getting, and quite frankly I've rarely ever gotten someone to say like that's not important to me. But like I actually at Culture Amp have kind of I don't want to say like found a way around that, but like we've started to be really explicit about like what we invest in versus what we don't. But then also we provide a strong justification of why that's not grounded in we don't care about someone's experience. So to like pull into this, like my theory of change, I call equitable design, which borrows or it takes ideas from anti-racism, anti-ableism, inclusive design. But this idea that if you design for the marginal experience, like everyone benefits. And so at Culture Amp, one of the things I say is I don't run any gender equity programs. There has never been a gender equity program in the history of Culture Amp since I've been there, and we are 50-50 women, or I think it's like 49.8 at every level except our C-suite, where we're majority women. And our VPs are majority women. And people say, well, that's crazy. And I'm like, yeah, well, we've prioritized anti-racism and anti-ableism in our program. So it's not that I'm saying I don't care about women. It's that I do not care about running gender equity programs because I believe the work I'm doing to solve for racism and ableism will positively impact the white women who are going to be the center of gender equity programs in the first place. And so I find that like even taking that in my work where I'm not saying like I don't give a shit about you, right? I can be a little hyperbolic at times, but to say like I'm not investing in this thing and I have a core reason. I think what so many companies do and what our conversation was getting at is this idea that like companies don't care about women of color or disabled women or queer women or especially disabled trans women of color. Um, and so rather than saying that because they don't feel good about saying it, they just say, we care about inclusion. They use this fluffy language that doesn't translate into employees' experiences, but it's also actually just not honest.
So this is something that I've been obsessed with recently, and this is language I learned um, through some incredible work that I was invited into through a Midiar network, and specifically from Carla Monterosso about yes, I know I'm like dropping that's dropping the name of all names, but she talks about trade-offs, and leadership is really about making trade-offs. And I feel like what you're defining is the ability to articulate what the trade-offs are and why we're making them. And it doesn't always, like, this is why leadership sucks, is it doesn't always make everyone happy, and you have to have the courage to make the decision anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an ongoing, and you will receive negative feedback, and sometimes you receive negative feedback for good decisions in the trade-off rubric that you're making.
Oh, yeah, and I think that's why you need to be able to articulate why, right? But I think in so many ways, and one, everyone should listen to Carla no matter what she's saying because it's always brilliant. Like I just want to put that out
That's
there.
that's also been
Um,
my
Someone
experience.
who's inspired me on so many levels. But I think that one of the other things is so often, and I think there are zero-sum trade-offs in the work that we do. I don't engage in magical thinking, but I think the sort of whole premise of equitable design, or the way that we've tried to do DEI at Culture Amp, or I do with my clients at the Math Path, is by solving for the most marginalized, the trade-offs that we make actually result in greater than zero-sum outcomes.
Mm.
And so it's not that that's always possible. Sometimes you really do have to take away from one group to give to another. But what I've found is the types of things that you put in place to support marginalized people in the workplace tend to have broader based benefits that doesn't necessarily translate in the other direction. And so I think there are unbelievable trade-offs in this work, right? If you're funding DEI programs, that's a dollar that you can't put towards something else. That is true. But I think it comes down to actually deciding like this is a better decision, or like what I tell my clients or what I write about a lot is the idea that like DEI can be expensive, but it's a lot less expensive than the outcomes that you have to pay for if you fail at it. And so I'm not telling you that it's not expensive. I'm telling you it is actually a cost savings over time. And like that's an example of an idea where like there is a trade-off. You're taking a dollar from something else to fund DEI, but it's actually a risk minimization strategy. And so those things can exist together, which are some of those paradoxes that people hate, but show up everywhere in this work.
I'm also hearing something about the courage of more expansive math, which is to say, the language of capitalism is zero sum, it is scarcity, it is like efficiency, it is all of those things. And I think with a longer lens, you invest very differently than with a very short-term lens.
Oh, absolutely.
And so you're also talking about the courage of long lens thinking, which of course inherently has many more risks involved because so many more things could happen in that time frame. And as smart as we are, humans are still not very good at predicting the future, which is part of why there are risks built into our decision making.
I think that's right, and I think it comes down both to, like, the long lens thinking that you're talking about is not just in terms of, like, the investments you're willing to make and the length of the commitments you're making, but also the timelines upon which you measure outcome and impact. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that there are any, like, shorter term, like, impact that you can see from DEI efforts, but, like, I just had this conversation because my team, it's January, we're going through goal setting, and one of the things we learned last year was we set 6-month goals, and we found out that that was super ineffective for us to be able to do our work. It actually wasn't a long enough time horizon for us to see the outcomes of a lot of the work that we did. And so things that we did in like March are just starting to show effects in January. And we missed that when we had to like go to the executives and tell them how we were doing in June, for initiatives that we launched in March.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing I would say is like capitalism and like specifically like shareholder theory, which undergirds a lot of the way that modern capitalism is structured, um, incentivizes this like quarter over quarter short term like reporting on results that just is incompatible with undoing the kind of systems of oppression we're talking about in doing DI work. So I think that, in a year, you have to be thoughtful about the metrics you choose, but you can see positive movement in 6 to 12 months on a lot of these initiatives. But I tend to think that like the big long term growth, long term impact that you see happens on the 2, 3, 5 year time scale. And so anyway, that's just something that like I think about is you both need to think long term in terms of your investments, but also you need to be very intentional about what your impact metrics are at each sort of time goalpost that you're going towards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, can you talk to me about some mistakes you made along the way and what you learned around courageous leadership?
Oh my gosh. I think I've talked about this before, but like I don't think that I had the courage or the self-confidence or whatever to push back on leaders who wanted to prioritize gender. So there, I would say that's not true in my role at Culture Rep. I like came in fighting for that because of what I learned in previous roles. But as a younger, less seasoned practitioner, um, defined priorities from what leadership cared about as opposed to the priorities as I knew they should have been articulated to make progress. And I think that that was a huge mistake, not only because I think in some ways, like I let down my values, I think I let down some marginalized employees who just deserved a better experience, and I could have done more to support that. But also, I think I actually let down those leaders who actually wanted to
Mm,
do the things they were articulating, but their method of getting there was ineffective. And
mm.
so I think that was the big thing for me. Like, I don't know if I would say like I should have gotten fired over that because then I couldn't have been effective in the role. But I think I could have taken a lot greater risks at certain times and pushing back and basically being willing to say like, actually, you're fundamentally wrong to people who are paid more than me.
Right. So what we got a really interesting question in the comments, which is how long does it take organizations to change?
Oh. My first answer, God, such a social scientist, is like define change. But no, I don't mean to be snarky because I think it actually is a really good question. I think it depends on like what change you're seeking. So there's certain change that I don't think is possible, which is like you're never gonna like set the timer to done and just let what you've done, run its course. And that's because we have like the systemic social forces of like capitalism, sexism, racism, ableism, et cetera, like pushing down on an organization, even when they have all the right stuff in place. So in that sense, like, I don't think you can ever assume that an organization has changed.
Um,
Um, I think that's important. But in terms of like, can you see immediate outcomes? I would say yes. So to me, 6 to 12 months, you should at least start to see suggestive progress in certain ways. So at Culture Amp in 2020, when I came on board, my whole team only focused on an anti-racism strategy, and we measured change as positive affect and positive change in the experience of Black employees, because that was who we were primarily focused on. And so while we saw minor upticks in representation in that like 8-month period in 2020, I think we moved up like 2 percentage points. What we saw was like 15, 20 point increases in feelings of belonging and belief in equal opportunities among Black employees at Culture Amp. And so that to me is change that does suggest that there's cultural change that's happening. There's trust that's being built. There is investment and experience that's happening that you can see in 6 to 12 months. But again, the danger is assuming that change is permanent. Like because you're on a positive trajectory, you can't backslide, which I've also seen. At Culture Amp, we've made amazing progress in BIPOC representation and leadership, but this year we slid back by like 2 percentage points, which is nowhere near a catastrophe, but it's also not continued progress either. And so that's our number one priority for 2023. And so I think when you say change, like a lot can happen in 6 or 12 months, but you should never assume that something has changed.
I love that the work is ongoing, right?
Always.
That you don't do a thing and then a certain amount of time goes by and then it says it's done. That there's no buttoning up in inclusive leadership in a certain respect. So that actually is a great segue to my next question, which is how do leaders best sort of demonstrate and model courage and accountability in their leadership? What's some advice you might give?
Oh, I think, and this actually comes from, not to be, too much of a Kool-Aid drinking cheerleader, but I've learned a lot about this at Culture Amp, actually. So one of Culture Amp's values is courage to be vulnerable. And I think that vulnerability is a key to this. So if you subscribe to like the Brene Brown theories of like this is terrifying and all that, I think Brene is awesome and has limits. But being vulnerable with your team or maybe one person, if that's all you have capacity for right now, I think is the most important leadership quality. I've learned a lot about this from Didier, who's Culture Amp CEO. He's probably one of the most vulnerable leaders I've ever worked for. And that shows up in a lot of ways. It shows up in being honest about economic forecasts. It shows up in being really open about blind spots that he's had to overcome, about mistakes that he's made. And I think that doing that is really key because what we know is that people feel capable when their experiences are witnessed, especially by people who are more powerful than them. And so I think it's really, really easy for people, especially those that are marginalized, but I think humans in general, to sort of deify leaders and assume that they didn't have these struggles or they don't, suffer from imposter syndrome or have fear. And so I think just saying, like, I'm actually terrified about this right now, or I don't know how to do this, but I'm doing my best.
Mhm.
It not only helps people feel seen, but it also opens up a space. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to my team and been like, hey, we have this problem. I've never seen it before. What do you think? And the best idea in the room didn't come from me.
Yep.
And if I had tried to be like, Miss Tough Lady and like do it all myself, we wouldn't have actually arrived at the best idea because I would have come up with it and that would have been worse.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is vulnerability to invite participation, which getting people to participate in decision making is such a huge core underlying tenet of psychological safety and engagement. people feel engaged when they are participating in the decision-making, especially decision-making that affects them. And watching a team arrive at a strategy after a really difficult question has been posed is so exciting. Like, it makes it all so worth it. The sun is fading here in Georgia and the lighting is terrible. And that's the best I can do, I think, going forward. I apologize. Yeah, I'm really hearing that, like, it's an invitation. And this takes me back to sort of the first thing that you said, which is there's so much pressure on leaders to feel like they have all the answers. And vulnerability is an invitation to say, like, I'm a person. I obviously don't have all the answers. And that is why we have convened this incredibly smart group of people who are very capable of coming to a really, really good outcome together. That sounds like leadership to me. That sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
And what do you think at the end of the day is your, like, some of your most important tenets of inclusive leadership beyond courage?
I think I talked about humility, like always hold lightly the belief that you know anything. Because we are all so trapped in our own experiences, right? That's just the human condition, such that like we have to be open to other perspectives. And so that's number one. I think like a subtenet of that is consider it a gift when someone gives you a perspective you don't understand or didn't expect. I think that showing appreciation there is both like, I don't need to give you like the neuroscience behind why that actually like is helpful. But the other thing is be dedicated to self-education. And that doesn't necessarily mean like you have to go take some fancy course. In fact, most of the things that I've learned about equity and inclusion, I've not learned in any formal capacity, but it comes from going back to the first one, which is like, I've been rewatching Game of Thrones, and I feel like the you know nothing Jon Snow is like a really good motto for this. Is like intentionally put your feed, you know, cover your bookshelves in perspectives that you do not possess. That's going to be different for everyone depending on the particular mix of privileged and marginalized identities that each of us carry. But I think it's really, really important to expose yourself to experiences and ideas outside of what you're comfortable with and what you personally experience. The next thing is you cannot be a bystander. So I think that humility and learning are really important, but if you do nothing with that learning, it doesn't really count. So I think it's really easy to say, not calling out white America in 2020, but I am calling out white America in 2020, is like, I'm so excited that you read Robin DiAngelo's book, but what did you do with that? How many dollars were transferred to the BIPOC community because you read White Fragility? And if the answer is zero, like, good for you for reading a book, but like, you don't get to add that to your tally of why you're a good person. Not saying you're a bad person, but I'm saying you didn't take action and you don't get a pat on the back for that. And so I think that's another thing, is translating that into whether it is making an intentional connection and providing mentorship or ideally sponsorship to someone who is more marginalized than you in the workplace, whether it is advocating for the creation of an accommodations policy when none exists at your workplace, whether it is simply doing your own internal work to feel confidence in the face of systems of oppression that are trying to keep you down, right? There's different actions that each of us can take. But I think that's it. So I think humility, like a dedication to constant self-learning, and then also a commitment to taking action, especially when it's scary, and proportionate to the level of power and privilege that we have. So to quote Spider-Man, because apparently I'm in like the sci-fi fantasy world today, is right, great power comes great responsibility. So remember that speaking up for equity and inclusion is less risky for those with more privileges. And so that means that we need to be intentional about using that privilege for good.
I love this all so much. And I now know that the title after we publish this is going to be What Aubrey Blanche Thinks You Can Learn About Inclusive Leadership from Game of Thrones and Spider-Man.
Oh my God. And you think about Game of Thrones, it's so violent. It's so sexist. Like, there's so many problems with it.
But it's got that one good line that we can all take away from it, which is fabulous. No, this has been amazing, and you're amazing. And I am so grateful for just your capacity to kind of bring these ideas to really concrete life. And I know that you're conversing in them all day, and you're also really doing the work and taking the action. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We're going to be hosting more interviews in the coming months, so please keep an eye on our LinkedIn. And happy Monday, happy Tuesday. And we look forward to the next one. Aubrey, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody who is on the line. I'm excited to see what you do out in the world.
And thank you to Chelsea Pettydale, who has made all of this possible. And this is her brainchild, and we all owe it to her that any of this is happening. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much.